Cecil, did you ride your bike tonight?
I just literally got home and it was like, I gotta run.
Yeah.
We just came from Mount Vernon. My son had a doctor's appointment over there.
Okay, guys. Ready? I'd like to call the meeting of the City of Oak Harbor Planning Commission, regular meeting this evening, March 27, 2018. The first item on the agenda is the roll call, and I'm pleased to announce that we in fact have 7 members, and they're all here present. I'd like to at this time introduce our newly appointed members, Commissioner Aaron Waters and Commissioner Alan McFeeters. Welcome. And then certainly last but not least here, a reappointment, Commissioner Jess Walker-Wise. Welcome. Second item is the approval of the minutes of February 27, the regular business meeting. Do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve the February 27th, 2018 Planning Commission meeting.
I will second it.
Motion seconded. All in favor? Aye. All opposed? Passes. Okay. Third item is as usual, the public comment part of our meeting. We will accept public comment for items not otherwise on the agenda for the first 15 minutes of the Planning Commission meeting. Seeing no takers, I'll close that part of our meeting. The item, public meetings this evening, our first item is Accessory Dwelling Units Ordinance. Associate Planner Ray Lindenberg.
Thank you.
All right.
Members of the Planning Commission tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that we have with our accessory dwelling units ordinance and some of the things that have come up with our previous meeting here at the Planning Commission level and also with our workshop at City Council. So what I'm going to do is go through a little bit of the background. We're not going to jump all the way into that like we've already talked about before, but then I want to discuss some of the things that we've found as in the process of doing some of our research into what other jurisdictions have done with their accessory dwelling units. So we'll just jump right into that. As we all know, the City of Oak Harbor and Island County Affordable Housing Task Force went through and did a number of recommendations to facilitate construction of affordable housing units. And one of those things was to go through our accessory dwelling unit ordinance and eliminate occupancy restrictions and parking requirements as a way to eliminate barriers and encourage ADUs to be developed in the city. Now, the occupancy restrictions discussed within that is specifically dealing with 1942-030 number 5, which requires that the property owner has to live on site either in the ADU or in the main house for at least 6 months of the year. And then further on in the text, there is required an additional off-street parking space. So those were the two key components of what the task force felt that we should be looking at to make it easier to develop ADUs in the city. Now, I went through some pros and cons, and that's in your staff report. We did this exercise last time, but after doing this research and going through the process a little bit more, we were able to flesh out some of these concepts that we had for the pros and cons for each of these two specific items. And without reading off of there and giving you a wall of text, pretty much what we have here are a couple of pros of eliminating the occupancy or the residency restriction. And number one of those is to allow for more flexibility for property owners. That would allow somebody who owns a house and builds an ADU to leave and rent both of those. Either it's because they've been deployed, or if they are just leaving town and want to maintain that ownership, they can rent out their property, and then that property can either be rented, each unit separately, or if they just want to rent out the whole property and then have a subleaser come into the ADU. So it opens up a lot of flexibility for a property owner. And it also, in theory, could reduce kind of a psychological barrier for the more casual people who might be interested in the ADU. Maybe somebody's looking at doing an ADU and sees this long wall of text that says, no, don't do that because it's a little bit too much to deal with. So if we reduce that, maybe that will help somebody who's kind of on the fence make that decision to develop an ADU on their property. Now, some of the cons involved with that, if you eliminate the residency restriction, perhaps you have less oversight within a neighborhood. The concept behind having an owner on site is to kind of reduce problems that might go along with renter or renter occupied home, including, you know, loud parties, not maintaining the lawn, parking cars everywhere, et cetera. Also, the secondary con there is that the future property owner or future owners of that house might not be familiar with the restrictions and regulations that go on with having an ADU, and this having that covenant that goes along with that might allow somebody to be more notified of what the requirements and the restrictions are for moving forward with the purchase of a house with an ADU. So other considerations we have here, similar jurisdictions have similar regulations. Now what I did, included in your staff report, is a comparison matrix. And some of those different key components of our ADU ordinance I've gone through and compared with other similarly sized cities within the state of Washington. Now, what you can see there is in that field of the matrix there, the gray items are similar to what our requirements are, okay? And so the green ones are less restrictive than what Oak Harbor has, and then the peach colored ones are more restrictive. So within that red box there, you can see the owner requirement on site. Now there's not a consistent or not a consensus there that says all cities require that the owner be on site, but most of them do. For the recorded covenant portion of that code, that again doesn't have a consensus, but a lot of places do require that. Now, some other things to consider when we're talking about eliminating the residency restrictions. From a staff perspective, I think there's less support for maintaining a covenant requirement. The thing is about having the covenant requirement in there is it doesn't really add any teeth to our enforcement of any problems that might come along with an ADU. It still requires that somebody has to complain about it. So just having that covenant signed document sitting in a drawer down Coopville doesn't make it so that we're going to eliminate any problems that might come up with an ADU. Also, it does require that you kind of step back and say, well, we're not going to notify future owners of what an ADU is and what your responsibilities are, but at the same time, that is fairly common with a lot of zoning regulations. When you buy a house, you might not know all the zoning regulations that go along with it. So that's not too far out of the realm of what goes on with your typical home ownership experience. So that's something that we would feel fairly comfortable with if the City Council and the Planning Commission wanted to remove that covenant requirement. That's something that might streamline the process or make the psychological barrier go away. That might be something that we could do to, like I said, streamline that process a little bit. Now, the second key component of what the task force was recommending was to reduce or remove the parking requirements. Now, right now, we require one parking space on site for an ADU on top of the 2 spaces that are required for a single-family residence. The pros to removing that parking requirement is it will fit in better with low-impact development requirements. Low-impact development wants to avoid having more pavement, and anytime you add a parking space, you're increasing the amount of pavement. Not requiring an additional parking space may reduce the overall cost of constructing an ADU, and that might be one of the key barriers to somebody not building an ADU, is that they're looking at the cost and how, if they're going to be able to get the return on their investment. And then number 3, and kind of least important of all, but still there, is that removing the requirement for on-street parking might reduce the overall visual impact of having cars parked along the street. As lots get narrower, as we try and fit more homes onto properties, the effect of having 3 cars lined up across the front of a house might be a bit of a visual impact. Now, the cons for removing the parking requirements, currently all residential units are required to provide parking spaces. from single-family residential to the densest multifamily projects. Not requiring parking for an ADU would be a significant departure from what we require for all other residential units. Number two, parking in the right-of-way might become congested. Now, there's no way to say that it will become congested, but it's certainly a possibility. If you're requiring or allowing the parking for these certain types of units to be on the street, then there is going to be an impact there. And now, while new pavement is counter to LID requirements, what you're doing there is you're putting any kind of contaminants that comes off a car into the public street. And public streets have a way of kind of funneling water into certain places that we might not want it. If you have a new parking space constructed on your site, then maybe you can take care of those contaminants and take care of that runoff on site as the LID requirement wants you to. Now again, going back to the comparison matrix, you will see one thing on here. All of the other jurisdictions require a parking space, and we feel that this is important. From a staff standpoint, there is not any reason that we can see that that needs to be removed. There is a consensus there amongst other jurisdictions that we have parking, and as I mentioned previously, that would be a significant policy shift. Now the consensus, as I said, it provides a safe and usable parking space that will always be there. On-street parking might not always be there. You might have a neighbor who has a whole bunch of cars or parks their boat or their trailer or what have you on the street. It's not always going to be there. And again, removing that parking requirement pushes that potential impact onto the public right-of-way. And currently, all of our residential developments, with the exception of some things within the CBD, require a parking space. And so going away from requiring that, like I said, would be a significant policy change. Another consideration to look at there is if you're looking at doing an ADU, perhaps in a garage conversion, you're removing those parking spaces from the available parking spaces, pushing them out into the street, and possibly moving things around from that standpoint too. So other issues going away from the two recommended changes that the task force had for us, we have a couple of housekeeping changes that we wanted to take care of while we're looking at this. There was a reference to the need for a conditional use permit. That doesn't exist anymore, so we need to strike that out of the text. And then there was a subjective requirement for additional parking as deemed necessary, which can cause all kinds of problems. The thing is that we have 2 parking spaces for a single family house. There's no subjective requirement that says, hey, you might need more, so we might have to require more. That's kind of what that was doing for an ADU. We don't want to do that. 1 parking space is appropriate. That's what the other jurisdictions have. Let's just stick with that so we're not getting into a gray area where we might be requiring more. Again, that whole might be that uncertainty for people who want to develop an ADU is not helping anybody. And then kind of taking a look at ADUs as affordable housing. As a staff, we went to an ADU kind of focused planners forum a while back, and there was some discussion about how affordable ADUs can be. And the numbers that we were hearing thrown around were in the range of $200 to $250 a square foot to build an ADU. That's a lot of money. That's not necessarily affordable. And maybe what we need to be looking at is, instead of viewing the single ADU unit as an affordable unit, is that we're looking at from the standpoint of you're adding more units to an overall pool, thereby perhaps lowering or at least holding off that increase in price. And from that standpoint, the Oak Harbor Code is actually really well positioned. Now, if you go back to that comparison matrix, you'll see Oak Harbor at the top there, and you'll notice those 3 boxes. Those 3 boxes show some of the ways that the Oak Harbor ADU code is significantly different than other codes, in that we don't have a minimum or maximum square footage for ADUs, and we don't have a maximum number of bedrooms. Now, all of those other codes have a maximum square footage. That's a significant change, because that's saying that essentially, if you have a 2,000 square foot house on your property and you want to build another 2,000 square foot house, you can do that. Most places will limit you to 800, 900, or a percentage of the square footage of your main house. So what that allows for is that number of units to be increased without going through a short plat or another process, but allows you to bring in another unit, thereby increasing the number of available units in the city And maybe not having an affordable unit on your site, but having another unit that will help kind of allow that price increase to slow down a little bit. So that's the kind of standpoint that we're looking at, is that perhaps ADUs shouldn't be looked at as an affordable unit, but as an overall strategy to reduce the total average. Now, we had some allied issues that I included in the staff report. Tiny homes, RVs, should those be allowed as ADUs? I think that as staff, we feel that we should stick to the concept of requiring any ADU to meet the building code. And there's a number of reasons for that. That's for the safety and well-being of the people who are living in the ADUs. That's for the overall appearance and property values of neighborhoods. And it's also a situation where perhaps if you start having a bunch of people living in RVs and things like that in people's yards, then that's going to negatively affect our ability to provide emergency response time, insurance rates, things like that to consider. There's larger global issues to consider in that situation. And finally, one of the other allied issues that we have here is Oak Harbor doesn't have a maximum street parking time. A lot of cities restrict the amount of parking on the street to 24, 48, 72 hours, something like that. In Oak Harbor, we don't have that. So the idea of allowing parking for an ADU, in the street is further reduced by people who park boats or park RVs or things like that in the street. And I think that the thing that we want to point out there is that providing that parking on site is vastly important. We feel very strongly about that. And that's one more reason I think that we want to make sure that we're providing to you our most strongly worded way of saying that, is that there could be a situation where street parking is actually becoming a shortage rather than a surplus in the city of Oak Harbor. So that being said, our process right now, we went through the city council workshop, and we are currently in the process of working on a survey to provide to local residents. We're going to put a notice in the utility bill for next month that directs people to a online survey, and we're going to have some information on there. And I would ask that if you have any specific questions or interests that you have as far as what people are thinking with regards to ADUs in the city, let me know on that. We'll have a number of questions on there kind of as a standard, but if there's anything that's a little bit outside the box that maybe we haven't thought of, I'd like to hear that. So then we'll come back for Planning Commission after we do any revisions and changes that we need to do, and on to a city council hearing. So with that said, if there are any questions or discussion, I'd be happy to field that right now.
So Ray, are you looking at a April 24 hearing?
I don't believe so at this point.
Okay.
The thing is about it, for our notice to go in the utility bill, that will go out on the 20th, so that's a little bit too tight. So, yeah.
I would just like to say I'm really glad to hear about the parking requirements, because to me that was a big concern. Because especially when people brought it up and said, well, where are these areas? There'll be plenty of parking because the streets are so wide and stuff like that. And then you brought it out to where it doesn't mean that the ADUs will not be in just this place here. They can go all over the city. Because as we all know, the streets are becoming narrower as we're doing more development. That's part of the problem. Or not part of the problem, but that's part of the solutions nowadays to reduce the runoff. But to me, the additional parking is a really good thing that we're doing. So I'm really glad to see that.
I have a couple comments and questions.
Okay.
I want to go back to the owner occupancy requirement. There's a con here that just says, or a pro actually, an on-site owner may be more in tune to problems arising, will be easier to contact. And my comment to that is just it's not any different if we had a landlord in town that owned multiple properties and lived out of state. My interpretation of them being on site, I guess, isn't as important. And the other thing is just considering our community is highly transient, so we have people coming in and going out all the time, and I really do feel like the owner occupancy requirement is one of those barriers. So just my own comment would be that I think that should be really looked at. And when you look at the matrix that you provided and you look at Arlington, Ellensburg, and Port Angeles, they do not have an owner occupancy requirement, and they also don't require the covenant. So that's just my interpretation of that piece. The other question I have is, I agree that the parking should remain the same. And am I correct in Port Angeles has the same LID requirements as us? Are they like PERS 2, is that?
Phase 2 city, and I don't know that they are or not. I don't recall that list. But we could certainly cross-check the list of comparable cities that Ray provided to the Planning Commission against the list of Phase 2 stormwater cities to see how they match up.
Yeah, I just think it's important to keep the parking restriction in place regardless of the LID requirements, and seeing that it's consistent with all of the other cities that you were looking at. More of a safety issue, as you presented in the cons, that it'd be less safe if they were parking anywhere or didn't have parking. And that might be all of my questions for right now. Oh, one more. So you mentioned that the code is well positioned, and when we look at the code in comparison to the other cities that you provided, it's not as restrictive. I was sitting on the Affordable Housing Task Force, so I remember us spending a lot of time talking about ADUs, and now I'm looking at it thinking, well, our code is pretty good. So would the staff agree that the true barrier is owner occupancy or parking, or are there other barriers that we're not looking at?
You know, I'm not sure that there are barriers per se. I think that the thing that we came out of the planning forum with regards to ADUs is that a lot of cities went through a process where they changed their ADU ordinance, or they allowed ADUs or whatever it was, and just not a lot of them get built. I think it was, which city was it? They had a maximum of 10, and they had built 2. Or something like that. They wanted to have a pilot project to allow for up to 10, find out how it worked out. They passed this ordinance 6-7 years ago, and they've had 2 of them built. So the thing is about it is that perhaps it's not that great of a demand for ADUs right now, or maybe it is something that's in our code that's stopping people, or maybe it's something in our code that's stopping 3 people. It's hard to say. I've had personal experience working downstairs. Probably 3 or 4 people come and talk to me about ADUs in 3.5 years that I've worked here, and nobody's come back in after we gave them the requirements. So like I said, I don't know if it's something in our code that's telling them no, or if they've just decided that it wasn't the time to do it.
So could I add a little bit of historical information to that? So if memory serves me correctly, we put the ADU provisions in the code in the early 2000s, I think. And then, because the state was encouraging us to do that through the Growth Management Act. And then a couple of years later, if I remember correctly, back up, at that time it also required a conditional use permit, which is why you see that leftover language in the code. That was perceived as being a potential barrier. The state, during one of our reviews, suggested that we take that language out, and then we did at that time. But, so I guess my point is, this has been in place probably for at least 15 years, and I think my experience is similar to Ray's in terms of the amount of individuals that inquire about it. It's hard to know from the staff's perspective about why people don't do something as opposed to why they might do it, because it's just not resulting in applications. And we don't have a good way of keeping track of those 3 or 4 people that he's talked to in 3.5 years, and then following up with them to find out, well, why did you choose not to do it? It might be because that family member they were intending to serve with that went someplace else. It might be that they decided they didn't want to be the hassle of being a landlord. It's so hard for us to know. I think what we do know is historically there's a few of them in the community that always take place under the radar, so to speak. And I think that's been for as long as I've been in the planning profession. it's very difficult for us to understand why they aren't being utilized. If I was going to guess, I would maybe guess that it's land value and property value, but I don't know that that's the case yet. Maybe our land value isn't high enough where people are saying that that's something that they really want to take advantage of.
Actually, go ahead.
I've got a whole bunch, so.
As I was reading this over, and my thinking was influenced a little bit by an article I read on city, I don't remember the website, but they were talking about single-room occupancy and how that had previously been an important issue for lower housing costs in major cities. So I may be getting a little confused here. Does the ADU code cover things like renting out rooms, boarding houses, or is it just building a separate unit or carving your house into two completely separate residences?
That is the extent of it, the second part there. It's either an attached accessory dwelling unit, which includes its own sleeping area, cooking and bathing facilities, or a detached one, which is, the unit built in your backyard. So there's, garage conversions, there's, creating something out of a basement, there's all kinds of different ways of doing it, but they all have the common aspect of having the sleeping area, the cooking area, and the bathing and bathroom facility.
Okay.
And so that's what we consider a separate unit for an ADU.
Okay. In the early 1990s, I lived in Spokane, and I lived in a house, relatively modest-sized house, that had been carved into 3 or 4 separate apartments, none of which had parking of their own. And I noticed that this code only allows one auxiliary dwelling unit per property. Why that limitation?
I think there's a couple of things there. We have zoning for greater density for a multifamily project or a multifamily, if you want to take a home and divide it into multiple units more than 2. It's also kind of a reflection of our R1 zoning being very kind of suburban in nature.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the development of this city happened, post World War II, when people had their bigger house or bigger lots and houses on an individual lot. And so I think a lot of that stems from that kind of worldview almost, that you have a single family house and you have a neighborhood full of single family houses. And so for somebody to come in and divide a single family house into 3 or 4 units might be a bit of a shock to the system.
Okay.
And so our code, and I think it reflects in many other codes that you see up there, that the limit is 1 ADU, 1 extra unit to go with your single family home. If you want to have more units, then you're looking at doing a different zone.
Okay. Oh, so this really only applies to the R1 zoning then?
It applies to properties that have a single family residence on them.
Okay. Okay. I'm wondering about, well, getting to the con on the owner occupied, is there any, touching on what Commissioner Walker-Weiss was asking, how does the city handle complaints for single-family homes that are rented out just by themselves? Is there anything in the code that requires the owner to be contactable by the neighbors or anything like that?
No.
Okay.
Generally, I think the complaints stem from, there's usually a couple categories that you can kind of identify. It's like loud parties, poorly maintained. And those 2 things are kind of key when you're dealing with any type of rental. And so one is a police action,
Mm-hmm.
and one is a zoning enforcement action. And so either one of those has access to find out who the owner is and what, how we can fix it, what we can do to resolve it. And from the standpoint of the zoning enforcement, we send out a letter. If we get a complaint about, tall weeds or poor maintenance or what have you, we send out a letter to the owner and say, you have X number of, days to clean this up, to fix it, whatever it is. And so I think if a similar situation, if there was a problem party house or something along those lines, the police department would do something similar. They'd contact the owner and say, look, you need to get this resolved. So no, there's not. And that, I think the issue there is not so much the potential for that to happen in a rental. It's more the potential for that to happen in 2 rentals on one property. or also the kind of eyes on the street situation where if you live in that accessory house and your landlord lives on site, probably more likely to kind of mind your P's and Q's. So,
Okay. With regard to the question about parking, since this was brought up by the Affordable Housing Task Force, I'm wondering if the requirement to have a parking space makes less of these ADUs available. And are we making an assumption that everybody who wants to move into an ADU would have a car? If we're trying to talk about people who are low income or what have you, we may be requiring parking space for some people who don't have a car, which wouldn't make a lot of sense. Now, I noticed that, yes, I saw in your matrix that all the other communities that have this kind of thing have a one space requirement, but are we addressing the problem that bringing this up is trying to address by having that requirement?
well, I think you bring up an important point. When you mentioned Spokane and you lived in a house that had multiple units in it, I'm going to make an assumption that that wasn't an area that was served by a bus or something along those lines.
Yes.
So that's kind of a key difference with the city of Oak Harbor. In larger cities or more dense cities, you can get by easier without having a car. Whereas in Oak Harbor, I think almost the assumption is that if you have a job and you have a place to live, that you probably need a car to get around. At the same time, you look at that I think, again, we go back to the idea of you're kind of viewing this from a standpoint of a suburban type development.
Mm-hmm.
That if somebody wanted to build an ADU in my neighborhood up by the high school, for instance, there's not a lot of shopping close by. There's not your work places close by. There's not things like that. So kind of the assumption is that, yeah, you probably are going to need a car or want a car at least to be able to get around. And so for us to say that, parking isn't required for everyone, for all ADUs, because that's how we'd have to do it. We'd have to either take it yes or no.
Sure.
That maybe it's okay for a house that's in this neighborhood and, it's somebody who wants to live without a car and live, kind of a low stress life and walk to work and do all that sort of thing, which is great. But it doesn't necessarily work for everywhere, and that's kind of what we have to work with, is we are looking at kind of a one-size-fits-all situation, and so we have to find out what's best for the entire community.
Okay, fair enough. Actually, I think that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, bear with me, I've got a fair number of questions. The first one, the occupancy requirements. So I know somebody in the city of Oak Harbor who has a house with an ADU in it, and his life circumstances changed. I don't know the circumstances, but, perhaps his children grew up, mother-in-law moved out. He no longer needs this large house, but wants to maintain it for the income because it's has potential for good income production. He's since downsized. Is he forced into a situation now where he's got a house with an ADU in it that he no longer wants to live in because the size doesn't fit his needs, and he's forced to sell it or forced to rent it out as a single unit, when in fact, if we're trying to make affordable housing and the double income from 2 units could really help him out to stay in a house, are we hurting people by having those kind of requirements? And I don't expect an answer necessarily, but it's something I want to consider. The same thing goes with somebody who, grows older, the kids are gone, they don't need the big house with the ADU anymore, but they want to keep the income. Or let's just say that they've grown older and they spend 7 months of the year in Arizona, and they don't want to sell their house. They come back and use it for 5 months a year. Or maybe they moved into the ADU and are renting out the big house. Mm-hmm. The fact that they're gone for more than some arbitrary 6 months, is that going to force them to do something that they don't necessarily want to do? That requiring a property to be was it a permanent residence? They may have a permanent residence in another state or another area of Washington, for that matter, for personal reasons. I think that's overly restrictive, personally. And the next one really is a question. And you guys as planners may know the answer to this, probably do. You know, is there any quantifiable evidence that show that rentals with homeowners on site cause fewer problems than those with absentee landlords? You know, we have all seen situations where homeowners are worse than any renter that ever lived in the house. But, you know, are we able to really prove that by having the homeowner on site, it results in less complaints from the rental? And you guys may have seen the studies that say that.
No, I'm not familiar with any particular studies. Maybe Ray is. We don't have the ability to track that kind of, we don't try to collect that information here in the city as part of our code enforcement process. I think what I would say as a planner is that is certainly a long-held belief by communities. I mean, that's the age-old struggle or battle, if you will, between owner-occupied and rental. Earlier, we were talking about multifamily structures, and probably many of you have been involved in conversations where people will say to you, well, multifamily is great as long as it's condos, which implies ownership, as opposed to apartments, which implies rentals. From a city code perspective, they're both multifamily, right? And so we regulate the land use, we don't regulate the form of ownership. But certainly many communities and citizens hold the belief that that owners are better than renters. Staff doesn't hold an opinion on that one way or the other. But this is why this is such a challenging policy question for you and the council, I think.
Yeah, and in my anecdotal experience, admittedly, as the president of a homeowners association, I can tell you that there are a number of homeowners who are much more of a problem than any of the renters that we have. But again, that's just anecdotal. I don't know
I think the
if
only
that means anything.
quantifiable thing you can say about that, I agree with what Steve's saying. I don't think there's any research that's been done. I think the only thing you can point to is that possibly instead of having one bad renter on a property, you'd have two bad renters on a property.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that I could point to. You could say, look, there's numbers here. Otherwise, yeah, there's definitely good owners, good renters, bad renters. It's kind of a toss of the dice at that point to see what you have. So I think that's the only thing you can point to. As far as enforcement, you know, we can still enforce. So it's, I don't think, a huge deal.
And the word I was searching for, and it just has come to me, is stereotypes, right? I mean, I think that that's the typical stereotype that's out there. And of course, from a staff perspective, we want to avoid that with you know, every possible means that we can. So we're trying to provide to the Planning Commission, from a code analysis perspective, what we think we can see as the pluses and minuses to these couple of ideas.
Yeah, and I know that particularly as planners, you guys research things very much from what are the unintended consequences of changing the laws. And I think one of the unintended consequences, particularly of putting a law on that restricts occupancy, a residency requirement, is that you are trying to make, theoretically, we're trying to make this an affordable housing change to benefit affordable housing, and it may in fact have the exact opposite effect if we leave a occupancy restriction on there that is relatively random. Let me talk a little bit about parking if I can. Sure. So a couple of scenarios I was thinking through, you know, as I'm driving around town, which I do a lot in my job, you know, I see a lot of homes where there's cars parked on the front yard. You know, sometimes the line between off-street parking and on-street parking is kind of, you know, because there's a lot of neighborhoods that don't have curbs, and so what is what? I was driving around today and I saw a house with 7 cars parked in what I would think to be the city right-of-way, and none parked in the driveway, or who knows what was in the garage. There's homes out there that have no garage and no effective driveway in some of the older parts of town. So I don't want us to have an extraordinary parking restriction put on that isn't reflective of the character of the city, or even really required. So let me give you a scenario where, you know, we have an older home. It has a 1-car garage and it has one effective space in the driveway for a vehicle, so effectively it has the two required by the underlying code. If they do a garage conversion, now it only has one. Are they gonna have to add one parking space, or are they gonna have to add two parking spaces because they already don't meet the underlying code? You know, once they've done the garage conversion, if they make that garage conversion an ADU, now they have to add, you get where I'm coming from. So they have to add two spaces to the one driveway space?
That would be my interpretation, yeah.
Yeah. And if a car has, or if a house has a two-car garage and two spaces in the driveway where they've got 4 effective spaces, but they want to put a separate ADU in, are they now required to have 5 spaces? Because,
No, they would still, the requirement would still be 3 spaces.
but it
So-
says an additional space. Is that
It says
only additional over the underlying
Additional
code?
to, yeah, additional to the 2 that are required by the code for this single-family house.
Okay. You know, personally, I would be happy with, as long as they've got 2 spots off-road, off-street, you know, that's probably the minimum, but there's some that don't have that right now and don't even have ADUs, so. I guess my last comment would be, have you thought about reassessing the, in the accessory dwelling unit code, the 1942-030, 7 and 8, where we talked about this, I think, before, or maybe it was discussed at one of the city council things. But anyway, yeah, you know, making the primary unit and the accessory dwelling unit appear as one residence, and have the access to the accessory dwelling unit, you know, unobtrusive from the street. I have a big lot where I live, 3/4 of an acre, more than that, and to make the ADU look like it's part of the residence is quite frankly silly. To have to put the ADU right next to the house when it may make much more sense and be much more attractive from the character of the neighborhood if it's well away from the main house.
Yeah, and that's one of the parts of the code that's a little bit subjective. So, yeah,
So have you considered reassessing that as being in there?
we can certainly do that. It's, like I say, it's kind of subjective. There are a number of issues that go along with that, and I think you brought up the idea of emergency access previously. If you can't find the entrance to Unit B, then that's going to be a problem. So it's kind of conflicting, you know, if you have this building that appears as a single family, but the fire department shows up and they know that there's a Unit B, but they don't know where it is, versus the idea of kind of maintaining this homogeneous look in a single family neighborhood. So which is worth more in that situation? I would say safety is definitely worth more in that situation. So unfortunately, it's kind of one of those things that we know it when we see it. There's a lot of subjectivity to it, so perhaps we need to look at that and find a better way of, you know, kind of qualifying what it is that we're looking for.
Or at least when you approve them, have the flexibility within your office to say, you know, it doesn't necessarily make sense in this particular property.
Sure.
Okay, that's all I have, thank you.
So I actually had a couple of comments maybe to share as listening to the conversation. And just a general comment, you know, if we think about zoning from the broadest perspective, it's, you know, it was put into place for public health, safety, and welfare, but also for the protection of property values, right? And that's been an underlying theme in zoning ever since it was originated. And I think it's no more true than in the single-family zoning districts, not just in Oak Harbor, but, you know, probably nationwide, that a large part of what you see is about protecting that concept of the single-family property and the property value and that particular lifestyle. Those are community values and community choices, and subject to, you know, modification as times change. But it would be interesting, and I'll work with Ray on this, to see when did these other codes originally go into their code. I shared with you, I think ours is probably at least 15 or 16 years ago, which really predates the national conversation about affordable housing, right? And so it was really, to use a very old term, it was a way to legalize the granny flat. I mean, that's really what it was intended to do. But if you look at the restrictions that you see in our code, and possibly in these others, it's about protecting the property values and the character of those single-family neighborhoods. Whether you think that's right or wrong, I think that's why those restrictions are there. If the Planning Commission and the Council chooses to view those through a different lens, through the affordable housing lens, you will likely come up with different answers to these problems than what our code currently does. And so maybe it's a question of looking at when did these things go into place, and can that give us some historical context as to why all of these codes seem to line up on the occupancy portion, but we don't all line up on the covenant piece. So the occupancy part gets to that traditional idea that if somebody there has an ownership interest, they're going to take better care of it, right? The parking one is also probably a protection of the neighborhood issue. So I think it just, if we look through the lens of affordable housing, if the Planning Commission and the Council do, you may come up with very different answers to this particular code problem. So we'll be back next month with at least some level of conversation. We won't be ready for the public hearing because, as Ray mentioned, we'll have the survey going out. We really do think it's important to hear from our residents, our citizens, so that we can get some additional input into this complex problem.
But to that end, the way you word that survey may end up giving you some very different kinds of results.
Yes.
Because I certainly came at this from the affordable housing. And so you may want to emphasize, or equally emphasize, protecting the character of neighborhoods and providing affordable housing.
You know, I think even planting that seed in somebody's mind is probably not a good idea for a survey. I think the questions will be very general, like along the lines of, did you know you could have an ADU in your property? Would you support your neighbor having an ADU? Without going into that, you know, kind of going down that rabbit hole of saying, oh, this is, you know, a bad thing or a good thing. Just, were you aware?
Very good.
I have a couple more questions. So I just want to say I'm in agreement with Commissioner Hovey's statements about the owner occupancy requirement. And I was thinking about our military community and someone coming in and out, but I think it's a really good point to think about our aging community or someone that maybe has a life circumstance that's now, you know, maybe they have to go to long-term care, and then what do they do with that property? So it's a really good point. Is there any enforcement right now on ADUs and owner occupancy, since that's within the code right now?
It's based on complaints.
Okay.
Like most of our zoning enforcement.
Okay, because I was looking at Mount Vernon has a renewal certificate of occupancy, so I was hoping that you would say there is something that we're doing, and then we could eliminate that task by eliminating that requirement. So you didn't go the right direction for me on that, right?
Do you want to ask the question again, and maybe he could get it right this time?
Yes. There was one more thing I was thinking. Oh, so the owner occupancy requirement, like to Hal's point, then if somebody had to move out of that property and now they're renting both of those properties and it's non-owner occupied, the only time that you would be alerted to that code violation is through a complaint. Am I understanding that correctly?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So you have no way of knowing as a city, like I live in a home where I could have, you know, housing downstairs. I have everything there. I wouldn't apply to you necessarily. I'd just rent it out. Is that correct? And
Well, you
am I
certainly-
supposed to?
I won't say yes.
Well, no. As a owner, am I supposed to notify the city that?
Well, if you're making any change, like physical changes to the
Well,
house,
yeah. Okay.
then yes, then you would get a building permit, and then
I already did that.
Right.
Okay.
But
okay.
but if it was a situation where you didn't have a kitchen downstairs in your basement or whatever, that would just essentially be roommates, right? Even if
Oh,
they
yeah,
came and went through a different door. It's when you start dividing up that space, that there's no longer any access from your basement to your upstairs, and there's a kitchen down there. That's when it's a separate unit,
Okay.
and that's when we would go into effect with that.
I'm going to play devil advocate here with the parking issue. I was thinking to myself, you know, maybe we don't know how many people do not drive. I have 6 employees that do not have a car, that use the public transportation, the bus, to get around, and one, in fact, lives in Coopville. I can see where there would be an opportunity for a number of these folks, that they certainly need affordable housing, that they don't need parking spots. And I think that's just, in other words, coming from some other eyes other than mine, thinking that, oh, everybody has a car and everybody needs to have a place to park the car. Unfortunately, we can't regulate which units require it and which don't. It's either yes or it's no.
Yeah, and
So-
that's the struggle. And also the thing to consider is, say for instance, you build an ADU with the intent of renting it out to somebody who doesn't have a car. Well, that person moves to another community and you rent it to somebody who has 2 cars. You know,
There you
that
go.
the devil's advocate, you can do all that sort of thing. And, you know, there are people who have multiple cars, like my family with 2 drivers and it has 3 cars. It's silly, but it happens a lot. And usually you find that if there's a driver in a household, there's a car that goes along with them.
But I think you raised an important point, Mr. Wassinger, which is you used the phrase looking at it through different eyes. And that's exactly why this is a topic for the Planning Commission to wrestle with and to make a recommendation to the council on, is because there are some significant policy choices here. And we do know that the demographics of communities change over time. You know, how people move about the community, the size of households, all of those things evolve over time. And, you know, a big part of trying to plan is to plan for that change. And so, you know, talking about real life examples of people who could benefit from something like this is great input for this kind of conversation.
How many ADUs do we currently have in Oak Harbor?
I don't know.
I can tell you that we would have far more ones which are unpermitted than ones which have gone through the process.
Unpermitted? No way.
And again, that's just part of the nature of it. And we won't know about it unless there's a complaint. That's the typical way, or actually the more typical way is when they wish to make a change to what they have. And somebody thinks that that was established under all the appropriate rules, and they find out that it wasn't. And it usually boils down to mail service. They want a separate address, or they want a separate water meter. And those are the 2 things which then bring to light to the city that there's an extra unit there that we didn't know about from a permit perspective.
And I'll bring up the rear. I'm actually looking at this standpoint as I've looked at from your eyes as well about the employees. But let's go back to where we're at right now. How many folks do we know that the children are still at home? I'm sorry, 18, 19, 24, 25. And you've got 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom house, whatever. You got mom owns a car, dad owns a car, he also owns a pickup truck. And then they have 3 children. Their children are now driving. Now each one of those teenagers all have cars. So now we've gone from 3 cars to 6 or 7 cars, and now we have another impact. But that, just a comment. I'm looking at this from more of a financial basis more than anything else. Is you made the comment about the per square foot building cost, the meters, Unit A, Unit B, whatever the case might be. What about the tax assessment on that additional structure? That could be cost prohibitive right there. It's no longer a $300,000 tax property. Now it's a $450,000 tax property. Nothing affordable about that. So I think that in itself is going to be the driver in something like this, simply because we've taken out the tiny house piece of it. We've taken out the RV piece of it. So all they can do is build a structure, which means code requirement is going to say they have to have at least 1 room, a habitable room, that's the health code, the bathroom, the kitchen, and a sleeping quarters. It's going to be a certain number of square foot. So I think that's going to be the driver more than anything else, and that's my perspective.
Ray, I think you kind of pointed to something that may impact how we think about this. rather than thinking about these units being specifically affordable in themselves, having them be just an addition to the existing housing stock, and when there's greater supply, the overall prices go down. Is that kind of what you had in mind?
Yeah, and I mean, the thing is about it too, is imagine that you're a family moving into town and you're looking at a price range, say 300,000. You can't find anything for 300,000. Well, you're not going to start shopping to 400,000. You're going to move down. And that's going to put pressure on the people who need the 200, the 250,000. And so if you have more inventory at all price ranges, then it's going to be a benefit even for the people down towards the bottom there. And no, it's not going to be, the be all end all for the $400 a month unit. That's probably not going to happen. That will happen if you subsidize it in some way. But to build an ADU on your single family property is probably not going to do it, because it's not going to be the return on investment for people. There's no way you're going to spend $100,000 building a new unit, or even $50,000 building a new unit, if you're only making enough back to pay for the utilities that go along with it, or whatever else, pay off the loan that you got to build it. So there's that to consider.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, or a two-part question, actually. Would it be prudent for the city to somehow find out how many need or meet the requirements? And would the survey be able to find the demographic of the question, like who or how many have cars or would be in this situation?
I mean, we can certainly expand the scope a little bit and ask questions about that. I think the primary or the original thought of doing this survey was to find out what people within the community think about possibly adding more, right? So, the homeowner who lives in my neighborhood, how would you feel about there might be more units in the neighborhood? Or what restrictions would you like to see go along with that? If we add in some more questions about, would you be interested in living in one of these? What are your demographics? We can certainly do that. I mean, you can customize all sorts of questions. It's an online poll, so yeah, we could certainly do that.
Thank you.
Stay tuned, I think. I think there's going to be a lot of conversation on this one yet.
Thank you, Ray. So part B this evening is the comprehensive plan amendment, park plan update. Senior Planner Kat Kamak.
Good evening, Kat Kamak, Senior Planner. So I have a quick presentation just to update you on the ongoing Parks, Recreation, and Open Space plan update. So as the Commission can remember, and I'll just go over briefly what we've been doing so far, because we've got three people that have joined us recently, so I'll just quickly verbally give you an update on what we've been doing. So comprehensive planning, the state has requirements on how frequent you should update elements of your comprehensive plan. So your comprehensive plan, there's some mandated elements that the state requires you to have: transportation element, land use element. Land use element gives us the ability to have zoning restrictions, which you were talking about. That's a tool that the city uses to determine what uses can go into what lots and so on. So that comes from the comprehensive plan. Land use element, that sets the goals and policies, and your zoning ordinance then is the implementation tool for that. So that's how kind of the comprehensive plan works. So there are some mandated elements in that, and there's the transportation element, and I don't have the full list of all the mandated elements, but we meet all of those requirements in our comprehensive plan. We also have additional elements other than the mandated elements for our own purposes. We have elements in there for the UGA. We have elements in there to be compatible with the NAS WIDBE. Those are some issues that are very local to Oak Harbor, so we have elements in there as well. So the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan is an element in the comprehensive plan, and through the planning process provides tools for us to deal with impacts created or to provide services such as neighborhood parks and community parks the plan sets up the basis by which we do impact fee assessments and so on. So the Parks and Recreation Plan, as being part of the comprehensive plan element, is being updated, and it's updated every 6 or so, 7 years. One of the reasons, when the city adopts a plan, those policies apply to our decision-making, whether it's administrative or political, in terms of it gives us guidance. It doesn't ever expire necessarily. But the state has a grant agency, Recreation and Conservation Office, that has a pool of money that they'd like to hand out for communities that need money to do improvements to their parks. And they require that your plan be updated every 6 or 7 years. So if we want access to money, which, we want to do a lot of park improvements, you got to update your plan every 6 or 7 years. So this is kind of part of the update that we're doing in order to stay in tune and be eligible for all these grants. The Parks and Recreation, the first one, I think, was adopted back in 1960s, I think, and then since then there's been several updates, and so there's a lot of goals and policies that were carried over from many of the previous years into the current document. And so we're continuing that effort, just kind of refining. With all the updates, we just kind of look at the goals and plans and go, are we going the right direction? Should we do something? This was done back in October. We had a joint meeting with the Planning Commission, Park Board, and the City Council. We looked at the goals and policies, and we actually made some substantial changes based on some decisions that were made earlier on. Things like, Flintstone Park. There was a push to get a wharf out there, and there was some upland improvements, there was some money. Well, there wasn't enough resources to complete that project, and in the middle, the City Council made a decision at one time to not further that project. That was a goal in the park plan, so we had to take it out because that's no more relevant to our community. So we go through all these goals and policies and make changes as we go through the update. RV park is another one. That was another thing that the community decided is better belongs to a private entity to deal with as opposed to a public agency. It's a big policy shift. So these goals, so the park plan's goals and policies have already been discussed, and some major changes have been made to it as we go forward. So we've done some of the goals and plans and policies, and I'll provide some of the new members. I have actually a table of what the previous goals were, and it has some statements on what statements we're removing and how we're modifying it. I'll provide you guys copies so you can catch up with the rest of the folks on the goals and policies. We also did a community survey. With every update, we do a community survey, go out to people, ask for input. I shared with the Planning Commission at the last meeting some of the highlights of that survey, and I've also given copies of the actual full documented results of the survey to the Planning Commission. I'll touch on some of the highlights just to get you guys caught up. And as we move forward, what we're also doing is there's a lot of mathematical analysis that goes along in this park plan. Part of it is just like the transportation plan, we have level of service analysis. And in transportation, they deal with timing of lights and how much delay you want to accept as a community based on your system. So there's A, B, C, D, and E. And you would think, it'll be good to have a classification of A level of service for all our streets because it's the best, right? Well, if that's the case, you'd be widening roads and you'd be doing all kinds of stuff that you necessarily don't want to do. So every community selects a kind of level of standard that they want to meet, that they think fits the character of the community. And so for cover, it's like D on the highway, I think, or D or E on the highway, and D for arterial streets. And we think that is sufficient for our community. And so you do the level of service analysis. So similar to transportation, we got level of service analysis for parks as well. And we have two methodologies by which we kind of look at it and determine what our needs are and what we should do going forward. One of them is a spatial-based analysis, basically location of parks. So neighborhood parks, who do they serve? How far do they serve? What should be the radius of their service? So if you start to get residential areas without any parks and you realize that there's several homes that don't have access to parks, you want to try and give them an access to parks. Even if you have quantity-wise, you may have a lot, but access-wise, you still want to provide a neighborhood park in the neighborhood. So we have a spatial analysis, and I'll go over some of that a little bit. And we have standards like recreational standards based. One softball court, field for every 1,000 population. It's usually 5,000 or 7,000, football field, whatnot. So you do those two analysis, and then you try to find out the needs. So some of the park planning gets into that kind of stuff, and that's what we're kind of actually doing right now as part of the planning process, and I have some information to share with you on that. So that's where we are in the grand scheme of things. So I'll go over a little bit of the survey highlights, and then I'll go over the level of service analysis that we have so far. And then moving forward from here on out, we'll do the 6-year plan. So, we have all the plans that we do are usually 20-year plans because we have a 20-year population projection where we take them 6-year chunks at a time, again, based on grant and update cycles. That's about the kind of bite size. So you do the 6-year plan, and then the city council gets into the budget process, which is the 2-year plan, and that's what kind of puts the rubber to the road in terms of where you're going to put the money to do these projects. So this is just everything starts with population, because if you want to find out what you want for your community, you have to look at the population first, and because you want to know how many people you're serving. So projections, they're done differently by different entities, and so it's not definitely one kind of formula for all. It just depends on community to community. And when we do them at different times, it ends up being differently. So back in 2009, when we adopted the last park plan, the population at that time was 22,690, and we had a 10-year projection that indicated in 2017 it'll be 27,603. That was just a linear projection, basically, based on trends. Well, since then, a lot has happened. We had a recession. There was actually a drop in population in the early part of the decade here. Actually, the Navy did see a lower population, so we actually dipped down in population and came back up. So the current OFM population for 2017 is 22. Oh, there you go. Okay, found it. So OFM population for 27. Now, OFM is Office of Financial Management, the state. It's kind of a neat system. When the state did the GMA, Growth Management Act, they wanted to base it on population. And they knew that if they let the communities do their own population, everybody would be all over the board. So they decided that they were going to do it. But theirs is just a standard. It's just a guideline. They look at a lot of information like migration information. When people go to change addresses on your license, they know that you moved. They're not tracking you necessarily, but they know how many people move in and out of the community. They know birth rates. People have to register when they have a kid, so they know birth rates. So they use different stuff. We don't have access to that type of information. We do projections based on what we see locally. So different people do it differently. So OFM predicts, that there's 22,000 people in 2017. And based on our 2016 update, which was a major update to our comprehensive plan, we did a 20-year projection, and we have 25,000 as 900 as the 20-year projection. So if you look, the reason I have the slide is because all these numbers are fairly close by. And so my main point was when we did our level of service analysis in 2007, we did it based on a 10-year projection need. And that number is way higher than what we're projecting in for the 20-year projection. So I think our level of service analysis is not going to change much from when we did 2007 to now. So we haven't seen that increase going, oh my God, we need, this many more baseball diamonds, so we need this many more. I don't think that's there. I think we're working off of the same need. Our analysis hasn't changed much. So before I jump into level of service, thought I'll go through the survey results real quick. We've had about 330 responses. It seems like a lot, but in the past, when we did it in 2009, we actually had 550 some responses. So it's actually less than last time. So what are the demographics of the people that answered the survey? We had 58% between 36 and 65, and about 16.5% above 65. 78% of them lived in Oak Harbor for more than 5 years. So this is a kind of nice stat because we think Oak Harbor is a pretty transient community. There's a lot of people come in and go. Well, 78% of our respondents have lived here for quite a while. So we have a good response. These are people that have invested in the community, they're working here, and they've spent some time here. So it's a good quality response rate. We split the city into 4 quadrants: northwest, southwest, northeast, and northwest. And we had 27 from the southwest quadrant. They were the most number of, from that quadrant, we got the most number of respondents. And the northeast had 18, which is the lower one. Community parks are the more used parks in the neighborhood. We have, Fort Nugent is our community park, Volunteer Park is community park, and Windjammer Park is community park. They have recreational facilities, and those are the ones we kind of use in our level of service analysis. Smith Park is a community park, but it doesn't have recreational facilities. It's more of a community asset, so we don't consider that into our space analysis. So just because you have a community park here doesn't mean it serves the 1 mile radius for what a Fort Nugent Park does, because the facilities are different there. So. And we have a lot of trail users. We have the waterfront trail, but other than that, we don't have, we have some private trails in homeowners association, but from a public trail standpoint, we have the waterfront trail and that's it. But 40% of our users use it. So it's a very heavily used trail, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that. If you walk the trail, you'll see a lot of familiar faces, and a lot of people do it in the mornings, afternoon, evenings, and see a lot of use on that. Not surprisingly, and this was the same actually in 2007 as well, walking and jogging is one of the most popular activities, followed by playground and biking. So people are pretty active. 40% think that our parks are in fairly good condition. One of the things that they want to see more of, we gave them a big list of things that they'd like to see. What would they like to see? And 49%, that's a pretty large percent, would like to see more covered shelters. I think the rental ones in Windjammer, and I think the Fort Nugent one has those shelters where you can rent for a birthday party or some event. I think they're reserved, and we get a lot of demand during the summer months, and that's something that they want more of. And I think as part of the Windjammer Park, they're building a few more there. But it's just good to know that that's something that's desired by the community. So Splash Park was one of the things listed, and they got the #1 ranking. But overall, trails and indoor facilities ranked higher. And what that really means is, so we gave them a ranking, 1 through 5, I think. And there was a lot of people that picked Splash Park in the 1 rating, and then it kind of petered out. When you look at trails and indoor facilities, you had more on the 1, 2, and 3. If you sum those up, you had a lot more of those than you did just for the Splash Park. So overall, they ranked higher. We've asked, where would you like to see funds spent on parks, and they said replacing playground equipment. That was one of the things that came up as a high priority. And we gave them, at the very end, we gave them an other box where you can write anything you want. And of the 330 surveys, I bet there's more than 85% of them that made some kind of a comment on either the windmill or the RV park. And I think people like them. People like the windmill. They don't want to see it go away. And they also like the RV park in its current location, but that's just, something to know. The community did like them. So that was just a snapshot of the survey. Level of service. So this is the level of service standards. This is kind of a national standard. We borrowed it from the national standards, and that's what they kind of have. What is level of service 1? Just like you have in transportation A, B, and C, and D for intersections. Here it's like, what categorizes the different level of service? So this is just the standard. So if you have trails within 80% of the city within half mile of a trail, then you would consider that a level of service 1 because it's very accessible. Same for neighborhood parks, 90% of the city within half mile of a park, and then for community parks within, again, 90% of the city within a half mile of a community park. That's the highest level you can have. Where are we in terms of the city? In terms of the city neighborhood parks, we have a lot of neighborhood parks, and they are dispersed all throughout the community. So there are a few areas that don't have them, I'll bring back probably at the next meeting some maps to show that. So for example, you know, in the planning world, we consider barriers when we look at level of service. For example, an interstate, you know, is a barrier. A railroad track is a barrier. An arterial street is a barrier. The highway is a barrier. So you may have a neighborhood on one side of the highway, and you may have a neighborhood park on the other side of the highway. Proximity-wise, they may be less than half mile, but it's still not accessible necessarily because of that barrier. So when you do an analysis like that, you'll find little pockets of city neighborhoods that still don't have neighborhood park. For example, the area east of Midway, south of Whidbey, north of Pioneer Way. That's a little area there, and there's no neighborhood parks there. I mean, you have the bus barn. You know, if you work with the school district and you put some trails in there, that'll serve. There's a lot of people that are interested. It's a lighted facility. You know, you put trails in there, and that becomes a facility that would work there. But kind of they're in the middle of everything. They've got parks around, but they've got some arterial streets that block them. Similarly, Scenic Heights. You know, Scenic Heights, that little neighborhood that goes down there. You know, you have Windjammer Park. You know, that's accessible, but they don't have a neighborhood park. They don't have where they can take kids to. So when you do those analysis, you find little pockets where they don't have neighborhood parks. But for the most part, 90% of the city is served by a neighborhood park. So we are a level of service 1 there. And and for community parks as well, we're in level of service 1. However, we do have some, the previous plan, and this plan will identify it too, the northwest portion of the city. You know, everything is kind of far away. Fort Nugent is far away, Windjammer is far away, Volunteer is far away from them. So you have a portion of the northwest part of the city that's not within the mile radius of the community park. So the park plan suggests if you're going to do another community park similar to Fort Nugent or something, look in that area because that's the lesser served area of the city for parks. Trails. We have only 75% of the population that live within half mile of trail, and that's because just of the waterfront trail is the only public trail that we claim is the city's, and so that's a level of service too. And that can definitely be improved upon, and the 2007 plan called for that, and this plan will call for that as well. Again, it's just opportunity funding and all of that will make it happen, but that's what the plan identifies. So this is for recreational facilities. These are just based on national standards. You know, neighborhood park, approximately 2 acres for every 1,000 population. Community park, 7 acres for every 1,000. And so on, basketball courts and all the way down to football, volleyball. So that's just the national, just the regular standard. So this is the current level of service based on those standards. So if you take those standards and you take it to our facilities, where do we fall? Now, I'll go over this in a little, just to show you how this works. You don't have to rely, this is just an indicator, right? I mean, for example, I'll show you here. So here's the population. We have 2017 based on OFM, 2017 based on our comp plan, which is a little higher because we did this, we did it based on the Navy giving us some numbers. So we have those squadrons coming in. So we have a little bump. Oak Harbor grows at about 1% every year, just 1%. And then we had this Navy squadron come in. They gave us some numbers on how many people they expect. So we kind of bumped it up. So there's a little bump. And then we get to like 2019, 2020, where the squadrons stop, and that's what we know. And then we go back to the 1%. So when we did that projection, so 2017 shows that little bump, so it's a little higher than what OFM has projected. And then we, of course, have the 2036, 20-year projection, the 25. So I've used all three of those population numbers just to find out what our need is based on the standard, the national standards. So just let's take an example. So just for the park acreage, we have currently 37 acres of neighborhood park and 87 acres of community park. And the level of standard is 2 acres per thousand, 7 acres per thousand. And this is the need based on these populations, or the level of service based on these populations here, and therefore our need based on those populations. And you can see, based on the 2017, our need currently, 2017, based on our OFM population, is we need about 8.5 acres more of neighborhood park. And if you look at the community park, today, we need 72.88 acres. And this was actually identified in 2007 as well. We needed another regional park. We just got done doing Fort Nugent Park, and we knew that that was already just to meet the current demand, and we needed to look for the next one because it's going to take 20 years before you get to the next. Fort Nugent was 20 years in the making. I came on board in 2006. They just put that community, the playground equipment, they built it with the whole community helping out, and then all the other parks were improved. It took a few years to do that. And before that, they had land acquisition and working with the school district and so on. So it did take 20 years to actually get there. So this is whatever population we choose, we know that there is a general need for more neighborhood parks and community parks. Basketball courts. So currently we have 3.5 basketball courts. The level of standard, and it's 0.2, I converted it, it's actually 1 per 5,000, that's what it is. That's a 0.2 or 20%, I should say. So that's our level of standard, existing level of standard. And then based on the populations, what the standards are, and therefore what the need is. So our need is, we need probably 1 more basketball court to serve our population. One of the things that you'll notice here is tennis court. Tennis courts, we have 5. Now, one of the things that we're not doing is we're not taking into account any of the school facilities, nor are we taking into account any of the private playgrounds and whatnot. And this conversation, we had this with the Planning Commission earlier on. It's easy to say, oh, let's take that into account and we'll serve more people. Well, yeah, the numbers may look good, but if you do that over time, those people are going to come and say, you're counting this as part of serving the public? No, you need to pay up or take over, which makes sense. So you got to be careful. Those are not facilities that are in our control. School can say tomorrow, no access for the public to their tennis courts. We don't know that. So we can kind of have that in our background and glad to have access to those facilities, and it's helping our public out. But if changes happen, then we come back to the level of service here and we go, okay, we need that many more tennis courts as a city. Now, that is indicating that we need about 6 to 8 tennis courts more. Now, going back to the community, we may not have a demand in Oak Harbor for that many tennis courts. This is just a national standard. Oak Harbor may want something else. They want pickleball courts. There's no standard yet established nationally for how many pickleball. Well, that's the demand that we currently have. So this is just a baseline for understanding our needs. It's not necessarily a formula to try and go out and try to meet this need. So even though we're identifying that we need a lot of these, like for example, softball, we have 0 softball fields. I guess the base has them, and so there's a lot of leagues that play out there. But, again, if they stop the access, all of a sudden people want more softball fields, and we know that we don't have any in the city. So we need about 6 of them to serve the citizens of Oak Harbor. So this is just an idea to understand, based on the standards, what it is that we need. Now, demand will say something different. So we'll write something up in the plan. This is what the level of service is. This is what it indicates. But based on our league's input and our park's input, what is it that we actually need? So we just try to bridge the gap here. So That's something that I wanted to share with you. What will come back at the next meeting is talk about the 6-year plan in terms of projects that we'd like to see in the next 6 years. We have some suggestions, and we'll bring it up with the Planning Commission and see what kind of suggestions you may have based on what experiences you've had in the community, and then we'll kind of move that along. So, any questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
And when you first started, you were talking about the projects and how they could become incomplete. What happens to the funds of projects that become incomplete?
Well, the one that I think we were talking about was related to the upland facilities here at Flintstone Park.
Yes.
Those were funds that were actually grants that we got from some other source, and I don't know the source for that. Those money, if we get a grant and we don't use it, we got to give it back to them. Don't get to keep it. It'd be nice if we say, we got this for this. Well, we're not going to do that. We're going to do this. No, so can't do that. So that money goes back. When we have city projects like the 6-year plan, we may have some approximate cost estimates with how much that's going to cost, but that doesn't mean that money gets automatically set aside for that. That happens with the budget. So we have a 6-year plan, we may have property acquisition for $500,000, trail improvements for another $500,000. Those are all just suggestions. And so when they do the budgeting, the 2-year budget, they'll look at it and go, what do we have money for? And can we do a trail project, or can we? And then that money, if they do feel like something gets done, then they'll put that in the budget, and then staff can go and implement that project. So that's the time when there's actually money assigned to it. So other than that, there's money mentioned in terms of an estimate, but it's never necessarily assigned. So nothing happens to the money, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
One of the things I noticed in looking over the old plan was at the beginning of the Tier 2 section, it says there's a 6-year time frame required by the Washington State Recreation and Conservation Office. And I noticed that this plan, the last plan came out in '09. So have we passed that deadline? Are we in any jeopardy for doing that?
Yes, we are. I mean, like I said, mentioned, once we adopt the plan is eligible for us. RCO is just one of the bodies that have the money. So for them, we don't actually currently have any grant applications to them.
Okay.
So once we get this plan done, then we'll be aligned up to get grants from them to do stuff. And grants are the other thing with grants is, there's a lot of grant money out there, but you got to have resources to implement the projects even when you have the money. That's sometimes the more difficult portion of it. There's a lot of things that we do. Grant administration is a lot of work, especially federal money. When you get federal money, there's a lot of things tied to it. So it's not necessarily free money. We do have to invest our time, and sometimes there's a match. Some of these grants are like, you got to have 13.5% match, so you got to budget that. So even though you have to go get grant only when the budget approves a certain match to it. So in your 2-year budget, if they go, okay, we want to do this trail project, let's at least budget 15% as a match, so somebody out there can go and leverage the grant money to do it. Because if we go and get grant and then we come back and say, well, it requires a match, then you got to go scramble looking for that money, especially if you're in the mid-cycle of a budget adjustment, and that's when things get a little tricky. So even though there's money out there, sometimes we are not in a position to access it because of the way we budgeted things or the other projects. The wastewater treatment plant is a big project, and a lot of resources are tied up in it. So we got to. Yes, currently we're not eligible with RCO, but our plan is eligible for us. It's just not eligible for RCO, but with this update, we will be.
Anything else?
All right?
Thank you, Kat. A reminder that the next regular business meeting is slated for April 24, 2018. Being no further business, the meeting's adjourned.